Hello and good morning, future leaders of America, and welcome to a new week. I say future leaders because today's topic, World War I, the struggle for peace, includes many examples of leadership, both positive and negative. Today is Monday, April 6th. Now, in a past lesson, we had talked about World War I coming to an end, to an armistice. Well, that was on November 11th of 1918, and the world celebrated that the guns had gone silent. But this was only temporary. See, an armistice is an agreement made by opposing sides in a war to agree to stop fighting, to stop killing each other just for a certain amount of time. It's just a truce. It's a ceasefire. They agree to just stop the killing. But what is needed is a treaty to bring long-lasting peace. And this man, President Woodrow Wilson, desired peace just as much as anyone. Remember that he was a pacifist. He desired peace. He desired a long-lasting peace. Now remember, Woodrow Wilson attempted to keep the United States out of war, and he reluctantly joined the war after those three factors we had talked about in a previous episode. But he desired a long-lasting peace, and so President Woodrow Wilson prepares to travel to Paris, France, to issue the peace talks that he desires. They're called his 14 points. And so he boards the SS George Washington, travels across the Atlantic Ocean, and becomes the first sitting U.S. president to actually travel to Europe when he arrives in Paris. And his 14 conditions are also known as the 14 points for peace. And when he arrives in Paris, he is cheered by huge crowds of people in France, as the United States had saved the French from endless war, and he wanted peace, and so did the people of France. Well, his 14 points for peace included these. Points 1 through 5 aimed to prevent conflict. Now you might remember MAIN, M-A-I-N, those main causes of World War I. The M is militarism, the idea of glorifying and building up your military. Alliances, the decision to agree to protect other countries and having them protect you in case of war. And sometimes those are secret. Imperialism is the idea of one country extending its power or control over another nation, usually for economic benefit, for money. And nationalism is the N. That is a intense pride in your national and ethnic identity and a desire for independence. Well, some of the examples in points 1 through 5 are to avoid secret treaties. That has to do with alliances. Practicing free trade. That has to do with imperialism. And reducing weapon supplies. That has to do with militarism. So those examples in points 1 through 5 are directly associated with those four main causes. Points 6 through 13 described new boundaries for many European countries. That has to do with nationalism. And point 14 is Wilson's pride and joy. It called for nations to join a general association or assembly of countries to protect each other's independence. Basically, the League of Nations is a large alliance. And this was not a secret alliance, though. And his hope was that this would create a long-lasting peace in Europe and also in the world. So on January 18th, 1919, delegates from dozens of countries, they assembled at this French palace outside of Paris. It is called the Palace of Versailles. And as you can see, it is a lavish palace. It is large. It has many leather-bound books. It smells of rich mahogany. This Palace of Versailles is a really pretty place. So, the Allied leaders dominated the peace talks. Woodrow Wilson, of course, howdy. David Lloyd George of England, cheerio. Georges Clemenceau of France, bonjour. And Vittorio Orlando of Italy, ciao. Who's missing here? Well, Germany. The German Empire was left out. They were actually forbidden to even be able to talk during this assembly or during this peace treaty. 9. Well, these three Allied leaders, the reason that they wanted Germany to be left out of the talks is because they were determined to punish Germany. That's England, France, and Italy. They wanted to punish Germany for the death and destruction of the war. And if you're thinking back to the beginning of the war and you're thinking, okay, I remember there was this Serbian nationalist Princip, yeah, he assassinated the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. Oh yeah, that's right. And then Austria-Hungary, who was really upset that Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated, then they declared war on Serbia, okay? And then Russia came to help Serbia, so they declared war on Austria-Hungary. Okay, that's Russia. I still haven't heard Germany yet. And then finally, Germany then came to help Austria-Hungary by declaring war. So Germany certainly did not start the war, but these Allied leaders, they were determined to punish Germany because they said that Germany made the most aggressive actions and caused the war to be so destructive. And they might be true. But Woodrow Wilson, he deeply opposed this harsh treatment of Germany. So these are some of the examples of how they wanted to punish Germany. They forced Germany to disband almost all of its military, get rid of its military. They forced it to give up its colonies around the world, these different territories it had controlled, including multiple regions of Africa, parts of China, and parts of islands and territory in the Pacific Ocean. And the real kick in the teeth was that Germany must pay for the damages and the war deaths incurred by the war. That added up to $33 billion, with a B, $33 billion. And these reparations were extensive. This is a lot of money. And it actually took Germany another 92 years to pay off that debt. 92 years to pay off that debt. So you could understand that Germany might resent this kind of punishment. Well, President Woodrow Wilson, as I said, opposed such harsh treatment of Germany. However, he did eventually accept the Allied leaders' demands for punishment as long as they supported his 14 points for peace. Okay, and so that's the Treaty of Versailles. And some of the Allies did reject his points for peace, but they agreed that the League of Nations, with that alliance, should be a part of it and that it could fix any other problems. President Wilson felt that this part of the agreement would make the peace treaty successful. And yeah, as he just saw there, the League of Nations, its logo there, looks a lot like a car symbol. Okay, now in order for President Wilson to get the United States to sign the treaty, he actually needed the approval of the United States Senate. So he has this big plan, he takes it to Europe, he presents it to the Allied leaders, they agree, but now he needs to go back to the United States and get the Senate to actually sign off on it. And he needed 2/3 of the Senate. Yeah, that's 66.6% or 66.6 senators to vote in favor of the treaty. And some senators opposed this. One of them, the most outspoken, was Henry Cabot Lodge. And he said this will force Americans into war. And he's right about this, that this is joining an alliance with another country, saying that if they go to war, that the United States will then enter into war. And do you remember who has the power to declare war? Congress. Congress has the constitutional power to send Americans to war, not the president and not some foreign alliance. And so he opposes this. So now President Woodrow Wilson really has his work cut out for him. He needs to get a lot of Americans to support the League of Nations. And so for 22 days, across 29 different cities, President Woodrow Wilson gave passionate speeches in an intense speaking tour to get this support. Sometimes he spoke up to 4 times a day with hardly any rest. Well, finally, he collapsed with severe headaches. He was rushed back to Washington, D.C., where he suffered a massive stroke. And now he's recovering slowly. He can't continue on, and he's unable to continue with any kind of compromise. And so, in March 1920, the Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles. That is without the United States. Now, one little side note here. As Woodrow Wilson has this massive stroke, he's incapacitated. He's unable to make other important decisions for the country. And his wife, Edith, steps up and starts to make many of those decisions. Many of the decisions that the president would be making, she was then making. And some people say that she could even be considered as the first president of the United States who was a female. Now, she was never elected, but she was doing the actions and duties of the presidency, so that is very possible. So again, in March 1920, the Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles. Does the treaty still continue? Yeah, it does. It still gets signed by the other Allied nations. It just does not get signed by the United States. And without the United States, the League of Nations is decidedly weaker. In later years, when crises developed in Europe, the League of Nations lacks the power that Wilson hoped it would have without the United States. So even though the League of Nations was a good idea, it was not going to be as powerful as Wilson had hoped. So now let's look at the map. At the very beginning of this war in Europe of 1914, we saw a map like this. We saw the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire dominating a huge portion of Europe, and those two countries together were known as the Central Powers. Now, as a result of the war, Germany lost many pieces of land to Poland, parts of land to France and Belgium, and its German Empire was now much weaker. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided up into Austria and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and even parts of it went to Romania. So those two empires were now fairly devastated. And in Germany especially, this treaty left a bitter legacy. Germany was left extremely bitter as a result of the treaty. Germany resented being blamed for the war. Germany and Germans felt betrayed and vengeful, and they wanted payback. They didn't think it was fair that they had been blamed for the war. And none more than a man who fought for Germany in World War I, this man, his name is Adolf Hitler. And in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler rises to power, and he poses a fresh challenge for the world, as now he is declaring that Germany had lost its power because of the unfair results of the treaty, and he gains massive power and eventually leads the world into a second World War. But for now, World War is over. The United States is about to enter into a decade of peace and prosperity, and World War I is over, it is done, and so am I. Bye.